The stale protein bar in my hand tasted like cardboard, but I chewed it anyway while waiting for the fourth Zoom meeting of the morning to connect. It was barely 6:30 a.m. My kitchen still smelled of burnt coffee from a pot I forgot to wash the night before. I had been awake since 4 a.m., chasing down a regional logistics breakdown that would have destroyed our quarterly service level agreement if I had not intervened. That was my life. My name is Wesley Vance. I am 48 years old, and I live just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. For 5 straight years, I have been the operational backbone of our company's largest enterprise contract, a massive accounts management portfolio worth $14,000 in annual revenue. In the early days, when our founder Wallace Finch was still active, he used to call me the last line of defense. He said if Wesley does not spot the mistake, nobody will. But that was when actual execution mattered. Today, the new executive suite only cares about how pretty your slide deck looks on a 30-minute sales call. I watched fresh recruits, young kids straight out of college, pitch high-level transformation strategies as if they had invented the wheel. Meanwhile, I spent my nights handling critical escalations for multi-million-dollar logistics clients. If we missed one deadline, we were labeled a liability. If I saved their operations from a major outage, they forgot all about it by lunchtime. I never complained. I just documented everything quietly and thoroughly. Most of the managers presenting in our weekly syncs did not even know where our primary infrastructure servers were hosted. They could not locate a system log if their life depended on it. But they certainly knew how to sell a vibe. They spent hours polishing their slide transitions while I stayed awake until 2 a.m., talking to engineering leads in different time zones. I managed to keep 12 logistics regions running smoothly and under budget. Yet I received no public recognition, not even a simple message of thanks in the company chat. I did not need their public praise to know my worth. But it was clear that the culture of the company had shifted away from rewarding technical competence. There was a board meeting about 2 years ago where Wallace Finch openly told the directors that I was the sole reason our client had not canceled the contract. That was the last time my name was mentioned in a public forum. Recently, I was not even sure the new vice presidents knew what I looked like. They had systematically removed me from client-facing Slack channels to streamline communication, shifted operations meetings off my schedule, and published technical reports I had written under other people's names. But I kept records of everything. I saved email threads, audit logs, and system metrics in a private archive. I did not need their applause. I needed leverage, and I had it. They just had no idea. On that morning, after the Zoom call ended, I closed my laptop and stared at the empty kitchen wall. I opened my private backup folder and pulled up the original contract from 2020. It took me less than 60 seconds to find the clause I was looking for, Clause 6.4b. Then, I quietly closed the file and made another cup of coffee. The trouble really started 2 weeks later when Bryce Colton arrived. He was the new vice president of operations, fresh out of an expensive business school, wearing a pristine suit and possessing zero actual field experience. I recognized his type immediately. Wallace Finch had a golf partner. That golf partner had a son. And suddenly, we had Bryce Colton running operations, acting like he had built the systems we had been running since he was in high school. He had a habit of adjusting his cuffs whenever he spoke, and he carried himself with the supreme confidence of someone who had never had to deal with a database failure at 3 a.m. During our first group call, he logged in, looked at my square on the screen, and asked if I could take notes for the team. I did not blink. I unmuted my microphone and said, "I will gladly document your first major system crash. It should happen pretty soon." He laughed, thinking I was making a joke. I was not. By the end of his first week, I was removed from all operations syncs. My regular meetings with the client vanished from my calendar without a single word of explanation. I sent a message to my director asking about the change. He told me that Bryce was just consolidating reporting lines and that there was nothing to worry about. Then, the new system updates started rolling out. They were half-baked templates filled with corporate buzzwords, culminating in a colorful dashboard that looked great on a phone but completely ignored our core performance metrics. I examined the underlying data and realized it was mine. They were using my formulas, my models, and my logistics flows. But my name had been scrubbed clean. It was as if I did not exist. I quietly saved every screenshot, timestamped the files, and saved them in a folder named Clown Show. I also noticed that Bryce had started taking credit for our quarterly SLA improvements, claiming that his new management methods were the primary driver of our success, even though the back end was still running on the scripts I had written. To understand why that contract was a loaded gun, you have to go back to 2020. The pandemic had just shut down the entire country, and the logistics industry was in absolute chaos. Ports were backed up, shipping lanes were closed, and supply chains were snapping like dry twigs. Our client, a massive retail conglomerate, was losing millions of dollars a day because their freight tracking systems were failing. Clarissa Ward was their head of risk management. She was sharp, blunt, and had absolutely no patience for corporate excuses. She called our offices at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, furious because a shipment of critical medical supplies had vanished somewhere between Memphis and Atlanta. The system was locked. Warehouses in 3 different states were completely paralyzed, and nobody in our management team had any answers. I was the one who took the call. Our managers had all panicked, but I stayed on the phone with her and the warehouse supervisors for 3 hours, manually tracing the trucks using raw GPS data and rebuilding the broken database indexes on the fly. I manually redirected shipments of critical medical components and personal protective equipment directly to the hospitals that needed them most. After we found the cargo and stabilized the flow, she did not say thank you. Instead, she said, "I need a name, not a department. I need a single person who is responsible for keeping this contract alive. I want to know who is going to fix it when it breaks." I did not hesitate. I told her, "Write my name down. If it breaks, I will fix it myself." We spent 9 straight days rewriting the master service agreement. We went back and forth on emails, Zoom calls, and late-night edits, hammering out the language. That was when Clause 6.4b was born. Her legal team insisted on it as a continuity safeguard. They wanted to make sure that if I ever left the company, they would not be left at the mercy of some generic customer support line or an inexperienced manager. They needed to know they had a dedicated expert running the show. Our sales director was so desperate to sign the deal and collect his commission that he did not even read the clause. He just wanted the signature, completely ignoring the massive leverage they had given to a single senior engineer. Our own legal team barely read the agreement. They would have agreed to almost anything to close the deal. But I made sure that Clause 6.4b remained in the final contract word for word. It explicitly stated that if the named escalation lead, Wesley Vance, resigned voluntarily, the client had the right to walk away from the contract immediately with no penalty or delay. I knew the exact value of that clause, and I knew how much leverage it gave me. It was our company's ultimate vulnerability, and it was entirely tied to my presence. For 5 years, that clause slept in our filing cabinets. Nobody thought about it, because I never planned on leaving. I worked 70 hours a week, resolved hundreds of system outages, and kept Clarissa Ward happy. Our contract grew until it was worth $14 million in annual revenue, making it the most profitable account in our entire division. I took pride in my work, knowing that my personal attention was the only thing preventing a multi-million-dollar disaster. When Wallace Finch was running the company, he knew exactly what I did. He understood that my personal relationship with Clarissa Ward was the only thing holding the contract together. He would stop by my desk, clap me on the shoulder, and tell me that I was the most valuable player on the team. He was a practical man who valued real-world results over corporate jargon. But when Wallace retired and the new executives took over, the culture changed completely. They brought in consultants, restructured our departments, and began treating experienced engineers like interchangeable parts in a machine. They believed that everything could be reduced to a process document and outsourced to the lowest bidder. Bryce Colton was the ultimate product of this new corporate mindset. He did not care about operations. He cared about metrics that looked good on a slide deck. When he took over as vice president, he immediately began questioning why a single senior engineer was handling our largest account. He wanted to automate everything, cut costs, and replace me with a cheaper offshore team that had no context on how the system actually worked. I tried to warn him. I told him that our systems were highly customized and that we could not simply automate the human relationship. I reminded him that Clarissa Ward expected a dedicated point of contact who understood the history of their operations. But he just smiled his condescending smile and told me that I was stuck in the past. He said the company was evolving and that my manual methods were no longer scalable. He had no understanding of the delicate balance required to keep a major client satisfied, nor did he care to learn. I watched as he slowly began chipping away at my authority. First, he took me out of the client review meetings. Then he revoked my access to the main dashboard. Each time he pushed me aside, I went back to my desk and opened the 2020 contract. I read clause 6.4b over and over again, feeling its weight. I knew that Bryce Colton was playing with matches, and he had no idea he was standing in a room full of gasoline. I decided to let him proceed with his plans, knowing that the fallout would be entirely his responsibility. By the second week of Bryce Colton's reign, the changes became more aggressive. He sent an announcement in our main Slack channel about cleaning house and eliminating what he called legacy clutter. It was a thinly veiled threat aimed directly at me and my team. Our younger colleagues reacted with enthusiasm, posting emojis and celebrating the new direction. I did not respond. I simply took a screenshot of the post and saved it in my archive under the label Slack Shade. Bryce talked fast, smiled wide, and threw around phrases like operational velocity and frictionless alignment. The senior executives loved him. They praised his fresh perspective and claimed he was re-energizing the division. Meanwhile, we missed our internal system failover test for the first time in 9 consecutive quarters because Bryce had pushed a major deployment over my written objections. I flagged the failure immediately, but he brushed it off, telling me we would address it later. We never did. I began keeping a detailed journal after every single incident. I documented each time he overrode a system check, ignored a red flag, or claimed we would iterate later. One night, around midnight, I detected a critical database metrics alert that he had silenced. He had buried an entire regional logistics outage in our southeast region, pretending it was just a scheduled system optimization. That single incident could have cost us a major compliance audit. I did not complain to HR. I simply copied the alert thread, converted it to a PDF, and added it to my private folder. I labeled it Burial Attempt Number 3. The transition to the offshore team was a complete disaster, although Bryce tried to hide it. The new team did not understand our routing tables, resulting in several major delays. In one instance, they misrouted a shipment of temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical goods, costing the client thousands of dollars. Instead of escalating the issue and resolving the root cause, Bryce ordered the team to silence the system alerts and alter the tracking logs to make it look like the delay was caused by weather. I documented this cover-up thoroughly. During a lunch break, one of our warehouse leads pulled me aside, worried about their job security. He asked if we were going to be laid off without notice. I reminded him about the Federal Warning Act, which requires employers to provide at least 60 days of advance notice for large layoffs. He thanked me, unaware that the real threat to the company was not a planned layoff, but Bryce's incompetence. By the 5th week, my access to the client administration panel was completely revoked. When I tried to log in on a Monday morning to prepare for our weekly operational call, I was met with a permission-denied message. I contacted Bryce directly. I explained that I needed access reinstated immediately to review the latest system reports. He replied that he was consolidating access, and that an offshore team would be handling the metrics going forward. I called him on the phone. I asked him if legal had cleared the change, noting that our contract had very specific continuity provisions. I warned him that changing the primary contact without prior notice could trigger a termination clause. He chuckled and told me I was overthinking it. He said they were growing past manual touchpoints, and that the client wanted automation, not babysitting. I did not argue. I hung up the phone, opened our master agreement, and highlighted clause 6.4b. That clause was not a generic template. It had been negotiated during a crisis and it was absolute. If the named escalation lead, Wesley Vance, resigned, the client had the right to walk away. Bryce did not even ask which clause I was talking about. He was too busy preparing his next presentation for the board, completely unaware that he had just cut the main safety line. Over the next few days, I watched as the senior leadership team remained completely oblivious to the danger. I noticed that the general counsel, Timothy Stone, had opened the shared contract folder several times. The system logs showed that the contract file had been exported twice. Clearly, compliance was beginning to notice something, but Bryce was too loud and too confident for anyone to question his decisions. He continued to tell the board that the transition to the offshore team was going smoothly, while our actual performance metrics were beginning to slide. I kept my head down, did my daily tasks, and waited for the upcoming quarterly alignment meeting. What Bryce did not know was that the compliance department had actually flagged the issue. A compliance officer had sent him 2 separate emails warning that removing my access violated the operational continuity guidelines established in the Master Service Agreement. In addition, Timothy Stone had drafted an internal memo highlighting the potential risks of altering key personnel roles on our largest accounts. The memo specifically mentioned that continuity clauses on major contracts required immediate attention before any personnel changes were finalized. Bryce ignored these warnings. He viewed them as outdated administrative hurdles that were slowing down his momentum. He even commented during a manager sync that compliance was worrying about technicalities that did not apply to modern cloud workflows. I saved copies of these internal warnings, knowing they would be critical in establishing a clear breach of fiduciary duty later on. Bryce was failing in his duty of care to the company by ignoring explicit warnings from our legal and compliance teams. And I was going to let him face the consequences. I knew that when the contract was terminated, the board would look for someone to blame, and Bryce's paper trail of ignored warnings would make him the perfect target. The morning of the quarterly alignment meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the office was tense. It was a mandatory event for all 140 staff members, including the board of directors and the founder Wallace Finch. The meeting was scheduled to start at 9 a.m. sharp. I brewed my coffee slowly that morning, using the same mug and following the same routine I had for years. At 8:58 a.m., I logged into the Zoom link. I kept my camera off and my microphone muted. My Zoom background was already prepared. I had configured a clean, black screen with bold white letters centered across the frame, effective 9:01 a.m. It was simple, neat, and impossible to ignore. Bryce Colton opened the meeting right on time. He was in full presentation mode, his voice echoing with polished energy. He shared a slide deck filled with colorful graphs and bar charts, talking about operational synergy, velocity, and scaling our processes. He spent the first few minutes highlighting what he called strategic upgrades. He claimed these changes would ensure continuity for all our major client contracts, specifically referencing our crown jewel, the 14 million thousand logistics account. As he presented, several of my old team members sent me private Slack messages asking if I was seeing the slides. They were shocked by the outright lies Bryce was telling the board. I watched the seconds tick away on my system clock. 8:59 a.m., 9 a.m. At exactly 9:01 a.m., I turned my camera on. Initially, nobody noticed. I was just another small square in a grid of dozens of faces. But within seconds, the text on my background caught the attention of a few directors. The bold statement, effective 9:01 a.m., stood out clearly against the sea of blurred living rooms and corporate office backdrops. I did not say a word. I simply lifted my company badge in my right hand and my signed, dated resignation letter in my left hand. I held them steady, close to the lens, so that my name and the current timestamp were perfectly legible. The reaction was immediate. A sudden hush fell over the meeting. A board member unmuted their microphone, started to speak, and then quickly muted themselves again. I saw the square for Timothy Stone, our general counsel, shift to the center of the grid as he leaned forward, squinting at my screen. He was reading the resignation document. He knew the contract inside and out, and I could see the exact moment the realization hit him. His face turned pale. Bryce was still running through his slides, unaware of the sudden shift in the room's energy. He was explaining how the new offshore team would handle escalations. Then, He noticed the chat window on the side of the screen. It was moving too fast to read. Dozens of employees were asking what my background meant. One of the product leads typed, "Is Wesley resigning?" Another team member typed a message of support, followed by a shock emoji. Bryce paused, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He glanced at my video feed, saw the badge and the letter, and tried to regain control. "Wesley, we can discuss any personal matters offline," Bryce said, his voice cracking slightly. "Please turn off your camera so we can proceed with the agenda." I did not move. I did not unmute. I just held the documents in front of the lens, my expression entirely neutral. "Wesley, this is not the appropriate forum for this." Bryce stammered, his polished confidence evaporating. He looked off screen, likely checking his phone for messages from legal. Timothy Stone was now speaking to someone in his office, his lips moving rapidly, his face grim. The founder's square, labeled Wallace Finch, remained dark, but suddenly his camera flickered on. He was sitting in his wood-paneled study, looking directly at my feed. He did not say anything, but his expression was incredibly grave. He looked at Bryce, then at Timothy, and then slowly shook his head. The silence on the call was deafening. The board members looked shocked, their eyes darting between Bryce and my video square. They knew about Clause 6.4b. They had finally connected the dots. By silencing me and pushing me out, Bryce had triggered a clause that allowed our largest client to cancel their $14 million contract immediately. I held the badge and letter for another 10 seconds, letting the gravity of the moment settle in. Then, without a single word, I clicked the menu and selected Leave Meeting. My screen went black. I stood up from my desk, picked up my keys, and walked out of the building. I did not check my inbox, I did not look at Slack, and I did not say goodbye to anyone. The cold autumn air was clean and refreshing as I stepped into the parking lot. It was 9:03 a.m. Behind me in the office, the panic was just beginning to unfold. I drove home in absolute silence, feeling a sense of relief I had not felt in years. I knew that within minutes the phone lines in the executive suite would be ringing constantly, and there would be nothing they could do to stop the chain reaction I had just started. By the next morning, the clock had run out for Sentinel Logistics Solutions. At 7:12 a.m., the official termination notice arrived in our general counsel's inbox. It was a formal document signed by Clarissa Ward, the client's head of risk management. The subject line read simply, "Exercise of Clause 6.4b. The message itself was clean and clinical, stating that because the named escalation lead, Wesley Vance, was no longer actively managing the operations, the client was terminating the master service agreement immediately. In less than 24 hours, our largest contract, representing $14,000 in annual revenue, had gone up in smoke. The board of directors called an emergency crisis meeting 30 minutes later. I was not there, of course, but the internal leaks came fast. My old colleagues began sending me screenshots of the executive Slack channels. One of the directors asked when the board had been made aware of Clause 6.4b. Timothy Stone replied that the clause had been in every signed version of the contract since 2020. Then, the compliance logs were pulled. They revealed that Bryce Colton had ignored 2 direct warnings from the compliance officer and a formal memo from the general counsel. Timothy Stone laid it out clearly during the call. Bryce's decision to strip my access and mute my role without consulting legal constituted a clear breach of fiduciary duty under corporate law. By ignoring explicit warnings from compliance, he had failed in his duty of care to protect the company's assets, resulting in a direct financial loss of $14 million. The board was furious. They did not want to hear Bryce's pitch about strategic pivots or operational velocity. They wanted accountability. The legal team was already preparing a lawsuit against Bryce for breach of fiduciary duty, and his career in corporate management was effectively over. Sentinel shareholders were also threatening a class action lawsuit against the directors for failing to oversee the transition properly. By Friday afternoon, Bryce Colton was stripped of all authority. There was no official announcement. His name was simply removed from the corporate calendar. His Slack profile was deactivated, and his standing meetings were deleted. When a new hire asked where the vice president went, one of the directors replied with a single skull emoji. The M&A deal they had been negotiating for months was also completely dead. One of the potential buyers pulled out immediately upon hearing about the contract cancellation, while the other demanded a 30-day delay and a full review of all active client agreements. Word inside the company was that the presence of Clause 6.4b had completely spooked the investors, making them realize how fragile the firm's actual valuation really was. If one senior engineer could walk out the door and vaporize $14 million in revenue in a single morning, they wanted no part of the acquisition. Meanwhile, I was at home, enjoying a quiet morning. I did not check my phone until the afternoon. I had several messages from former colleagues and 3 voicemails. One of them was from Clarissa Ward. She said, "Wesley, that was a legendary power move. Let me know when you are ready to consult." I smiled, set the phone down, and made lunch. By the following week, the story had spread beyond the company. A contractor had shared a screenshot of my Zoom resignation on a popular technology forum, and the post went viral. It was shared thousands of times, with commentators breaking down the wording of Clause 6.4b as a classic example of operational leverage. I did not wait around to see how the company would recover. I had already accepted an offer from a small, specialized logistics consulting firm just outside Raleigh called Raleigh Logistics Group. It was a lean team of 8 people, run by a practical engineer who did not speak in corporate buzzwords. There were no pitch deck consultants or MBA cowboys. The CEO wore a flannel shirt and opened our first meeting by saying, "Let us not waste each other's time." I signed the contract the same day. A week after I started my new role, a package arrived at my home. It was a small white box with no return address. Inside there was a hand-tied bouquet of lavender and eucalyptus, along with a brief note from the founder, Wallace Finch. The note read, "If you want to come back, we will do it your way." I read the note twice, then walked over to my filing cabinet. I pulled out the folder containing my copies of the 2020 contract. I slid the note into the folder, right behind the printout of Clause 6.4b. My way? It was far too late for that. I slid the drawer shut and went back to work at my new desk. I did not need a corner office or a fancy title. I had a clean screen, a reliable keyboard, and a team of people who actually cared about doing the job right. My resignation had not been loud, but it had been precise. They called the aftermath a disaster, but the truth was simple. They had spent years focusing on the paint job, and they had forgotten to check if the engine was still there. I was happy to be working with people who understood that a company is built on execution, not slides.